In the modern world, when we talk about things like God, the Logos, or metaphysics, it immediately raises a sort of nonchalance or even revulsion against that kind of terminology. Many times I have discussed concepts like yin and yang with a quite smart friend of mine. He just frowned, completely unwilling to continue, and called it vague. I understand this well because we are taught to be suspicious of things that cannot be testified to and verified through empirical methods. But life most of the time is not testifiable or verifiable in a scientific sense. As a Chinese person, I grew up in this exact environment. It is a very atheist environment where all sorts of things related to metaphysics were considered completely meaningless. In our politics lessons, it was described negatively as isolated, static, and one-sided. Because of that, the direct manifestations of metaphysics in the real world, such as prayers, rituals, and spirituality, were considered to be merely superstitions in Chinese society. They were seen as things that only uneducated old people cared about. There are also other somewhat related concepts, such as emotions, mental conditions, and beauty, that are heavily neglected. They just get dismissed as a sign of you not working hard enough or simply being useless. Because of this, I didn't really think any of those things actually existed. By the strict definition of verified things in the empirical world. I believed that some of them did not exist and others carried this dismissive vibe of, oh, it is just something mental. Pay attention to the vibe behind the phrase, it is just something mental. I remember watching Alex O'Connor commenting on someone who claimed to see Jesus, and he just said, oh, it is just a hallucination. The ability of the modern world to make us dismiss mental phenomena, things that actually happen, and decide most of the actions and outcomes in our lives, not to mention sensing the intuition, the vibe, the intention, and the meaning behind such mental states, and to remain entirely unaware of how important these mental conditions are, is actually incredible. By installing only verifiable things into our minds, we are left completely hollow regarding what gives birth to such conditions in the first place. It is like when you have body pain. Instead of finding out the root cause, you just take some pills because it is the easiest way out. As I grew up, after seeing many traditions and the history of things, I started feeling that the real world does not merely operate through the strict definitions of things. It doesn't operate on this fanaticism that if we just make things clear and scientifically research them, we will magically find the truth of the universe. Bertrand Russell was very optimistic in his later years that psychology was this fascinating new study and that we would finally be able to figure out the human mind through it. Well, 60 more years have passed, and we all know how well that went. When you realize science struggles to explain the depths of the human mind, you start looking elsewhere. For me, I realized my work at the piano touched on this issue. I am a classical pianist, and I spend a lot of time dealing with something that cannot be touched or seen. Music forces you to acknowledge that there is a higher truth, a tangible beauty that science simply cannot map out. And that leads to a very big question that always occurs to me. What is the foundation of playing music? What is the criteria for discerning what is good music? Or what is good article, even if we go further? These are somehow normal questions, even though today you might encounter dogmatic people who believe everything is relative and you just need to be yourself. But we all know society does not actually care about this. Society functions like a customer, picking people from the shelves and leaving many behind. This brings about a very dark question, which is almost a taboo in the modern world, that the very concept of good, or choosing what should be picked from the shelf, implies that there is a hierarchy. Otherwise, nothing would be picked at all. This is exactly why smart people always try to avoid mentioning that a hierarchy exists here. And the magical thing is, most people don't realize that the act of picking someone or discerning beauty is inherently linked to a certain criteria of what is good. Instead, they just automatically start repeating the relativity dogma. Well, that is actually because of lack of continental mindset, the ability to see the connections of intuition. But that is another topic for another day. Let's just face the elephant in the room. What are the things to be picked up and placed at the top of the hierarchy? In the modern world, this raises a massive problem. The philosophically correct answer today is that everyone has their own opinion and everything is basically relative. But on the other hand, if we view this brutal world from another perspective, we see a very strict hierarchy. We see it inside companies with upper management and lower management. We take airplanes and we see there are classes. And this sort of contradiction, having a very obvious hierarchy that is entirely based on money and capital, is very distant from the relativity this modern world is trying to instill into us. Or is it possible that relativism, in its lowest form, is really just a tool? Is it just the idea of trying to get rid of the obviously nameable hierarchies that the old world used, like dukes, princes, and lords, and trying to create a shadow hierarchy among people through the concept of money? Think about it. In the old days, if a duke told a peasant what to do, the inequality was obvious and it made people angry. Today, it is like clickbait. If you show people blatant titles of inequality, they get triggered immediately. But relativism steps in and says, hey, everything is relative, your opinion matters, we are all equal. It disguises the power dynamic as freedom. Many believe that money will bring them the yacht, the villa, the women, so-called freedom, and since money is ultimately controlled by the people who truly have power, using it as an intermediary doesn't trigger people as much as direct aristocratic titles would. It gives the modern person the illusion of being equal. Relativism is basically the anesthetic that stops people from thinking about the brutal power struggle that is actually happening. And since this money narrative needs to take over in order to facilitate our capitalistic world, is it possible that its old enemy, the objective criteria of what is good and wrong, had to be completely dissolved? Therefore, the foundation, whether you call it metaphysics, the Tao, God, or the Logos, had to be dissolved as well. Once we are unaware of it, we can only use material things to compensate for that spiritual deviation. Once we compensate with the material and stop reflecting on anything higher, we start hoping that these material things and economic growth will bring us to a utopia. Because the material compensation does not work in an instant temporary way, we just imagine there will be more and more of it, and then everything will be fine. That was the doubt that started growing inside my mind. But then look at the classical world, the world that produced the breathtaking classical music, the grand architecture, the profound art. Now the modern reflex is to immediately push back and say, but the past was horrible, it was just feudalism, poverty, disease, and class oppression, that art was just a luxury for the elites. And sure, I'm not romanticizing the physical conditions of the Middle Ages or the strictness of the old regimes. The physical hierarchies were blatantly unequal, but if you look at their novels, their paintings, and the very vibe of how people lived and built their society, you see something fundamentally different from today. They weren't just surviving. Their entire civilization was aiming upward. The music and the art weren't just hollow entertainment for the rich, they were the physical, audible manifestations of a shared metaphysical reality. Even the poorest peasant and the richest king lived under the same sacred canopy. They were oriented towards something noble, something transcendental. In contrast, many of today's elites, hiding behind our so-called eco-society, actually fit the stereotype of the manipulative, purely materialistic tyrant much more perfectly than the people of the old world, who at least feared God or respected the Tao. It seems to me that people in ancient times possessed a genuine foundation for their existence, not just in the West with the Logos, but equally in the East with the Tao, their art, their rituals, their daily pursuits. It was all anchored in this metaphysical reality. It gave them a certain intuitive, objective standard for beauty and goodness that couldn't be bought. And realizing that both sides of the globe shared this exact same foundation is what finally shattered my own modern atheist conditioning. It made me realize that metaphysics isn't something vague superstition or uneducated thing. It is the very soil that grows real art, real beauty, and real meaning. And more importantly, it might actually be the only compass we have left to see through the illusion and finally escape the shadow hierarchy of the modern world. And that is where I will leave things for today. In the next few videos, I'm going to be talking about what the Tao, metaphysics, or God actually are, but in a completely rational way, none of what I call lullaby philosophy. I will also be explaining the world of potentiality versus the world of reality and how they operate in two fundamentally different domains. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.